1963. I'm creating the most powerful mutant in the Marvel Universe. A telepath who can read every mind on Earth, control anyone's thoughts, stop wars with a single mental command. Jack Kirby asks, "So what's his weakness?" And I say something that shocks him. "He can't walk." Jack stares at me. "You're making the most powerful hero disabled?" "Exactly. The strongest mind in the weakest body. That's the whole point." That's when we created Professor X. And those two things, the baldness, the wheelchair, they weren't just character design. They were the message. Ana anlatim bashlangici, 022. You know, when people see Professor X, they see the wheelchair first. Then they notice the bald head, and they think, okay, disabled character, that's progressive, that's representation. But they don't ask why. They don't ask what I was really saying when I made those choices in 1963. Why is the most powerful telepath in the Marvel Universe confined to a wheelchair? Why is the leader of the X-Men unable to stand? Why did I take the character with the greatest mental abilities and give him the most physical limitations? It wasn't random. It wasn't just for visual contrast, and it wasn't because I thought, hey, we should have a disabled character for diversity. It was much deeper than that. It was about power, real power, and where it actually comes from. Let me tell you the real story of Professor Charles Xavier. Not just how we created him, but why. Why every detail, the wheelchair, the baldness, the age, the gentleness, why it all mattered, why it all meant something. Because in 1963, I was trying to say something about leadership, about strength, about what makes someone worthy to guide others. And I knew that if I just came out and said it directly, people wouldn't listen. So I put it in a comic book. I put it in a character. I made it visual, undeniable, impossible to ignore. The most powerful mind in the weakest body. That was the whole point. 1963, Balami 230. Let me take you back to 1963. It's been a good year for Marvel. We've got Spider-Man swinging through New York, dealing with his money problems and girl troubles. The Fantastic Four are arguing with each other while saving the world. Iron Man is learning that being a billionaire weapons manufacturer maybe isn't as heroic as he thought. Thor is discovering humility through his mortal identity. We'd figured out our formula: flawed heroes, human heroes, heroes who struggled with real problems, not just colorful villains. But there was something missing, something important, a message I desperately wanted to get across, but I didn't know how. See, 1963 was a pivotal year in America. The civil rights movement was reaching a critical point. Martin Luther King Jr. was in Birmingham, Alabama, writing his famous letter from jail. The March on Washington was being planned. Bull Connor was turning fire hoses and police dogs on peaceful protesters. The country was tearing itself apart over a simple question. Should people be judged by what they are or by who they are? Should the color of your skin determine your worth, your rights, your opportunities? And I wanted to write about that. God, I wanted to write about that. I wanted to create something that showed how insane prejudice was, how arbitrary, how cruel, but I couldn't, not directly. The Comics Code Authority, the censorship board that controlled what could and couldn't be published in comics, they had strict rules. No controversial social issues, no politics, no racial content. Comics were supposed to be wholesome entertainment for children, nothing more. If I tried to write about civil rights directly, the code would reject it. The book wouldn't get published. Martin Goodman, my publisher, would never allow it. Too risky, too controversial. So I had to find another way, a metaphor, a story that was about prejudice without being obviously about race. That's when I created Mutants. Mutant Metaphoru. 5. Mutants were perfect. They were born different. They didn't choose their abilities. Their mutation was genetic, inherited, something they had no control over. And because they were different, because they had powers that frightened normal people, they were hated, feared, persecuted. Homo superior, I called them, the next stage in human evolution. Not better, not worse, just different. And the reaction from baseline humans, exactly what I wanted to explore. Fear, hatred, calls for registration, for control, for elimination. They're dangerous. They're not like us. They need to be controlled. Sound familiar? That was the point. Mutants were my way of talking about any group that's been marginalized, persecuted, feared because of what they are rather than who they are. In 1963, that primarily meant Black Americans fighting for civil rights. But it could mean anyone, any minority, any group that society decides is other. And if I was creating a team of mutants, outcasts, feared and hated by the world they were trying to protect, then I needed a leader, someone to guide them, someone to represent what they were fighting for. That's where Professor Charles Xavier came in. Charles Xavier-Magneto, 7th. I sat down with Jack Kirby. Jack is a genius. He'd been drawing comics since the 1930s. He'd co-created Captain America. He could take an idea and make it visual, make it powerful, make it memorable. I said, Jack, I want to create a team of mutant heroes, young people with powers, learning to control them, trying to find their place in a world that hates them. Jack nodded. Who's the leader? A telepath, I said, the most powerful telepath in the world. He can read minds, control thoughts, influence people on a massive scale. He could theoretically take over the world just by thinking about it. Powerful, Jack said. So what makes him interesting? What's his struggle? And this is where I had to explain the concept that would define the character. He can't walk, I said. Jack stopped sketching, looked up at me. What? He's in a wheelchair, paralyzed from the waist down. The most powerful mind on earth, trapped in a body that can't stand, can't walk, can't run into battle. Jack was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Stan, that's bold. A disabled superhero as the leader in 1963? Exactly, I said, because here's what I want to say. Power isn't physical. Leadership isn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about wisdom, compassion, vision, the ability to see what others can't, to guide them, to help them become better than they are. And the wheelchair shows that, Jack said slowly, understanding. He can't lead from the front physically. He has to lead mentally, strategically, morally. Right, and more than that, he has to send others into danger while he stays behind. He has to make the hard decisions. He has to live with the consequences of sending his students, his children basically, into situations where they might die. That's a different kind of strength, Jack said. That's real strength, I said. Physical design choices 9:30. Now let me talk about the specific visual choices we made because every detail mattered. First, the wheelchair. In 1963, you didn't see wheelchairs in popular media unless it was a tragedy story or a character who needed to be fixed or cured. Disability was seen as something sad, something pitiable, something to overcome. But I didn't want Xavier to overcome his disability. I didn't want him to be cured. The wheelchair was permanent. It was part of who he was, and he wasn't less because of it. He was exactly who he needed to be. The wheelchair forced him to develop his mental powers to their fullest extent. It forced him to lead differently, to think strategically rather than reactively. It forced him to trust others, to delegate, to teach rather than do everything himself. In a way, the wheelchair made him a better leader, because he couldn't just solve problems with physical force. He had to solve them with wisdom, with planning, with empathy. Second, the baldness. Now, some people think the bald head was just to make him look distinct or to make him look older, but it was more than that. In comics, heroes were young, virile, handsome, full heads of hair, strong jaws, perfect physiques. That was the standard. Superman, Batman, Captain America. Even when we made flawed heroes at Marvel, they were still conventionally attractive. Peter Parker was a handsome kid under that mask. Tony Stark was a playboy billionaire. But Xavier? Xavier was bald, older. We made him in his late 30s or early 40s, which was ancient for a comic book hero in 1963. He wasn't handsome in the traditional sense. He wasn't physically imposing, and that was deliberate, because I wanted to show that heroism isn't about youth or beauty or physical perfection. Xavier's power was mental, spiritual, moral. His appearance didn't matter, or rather his appearance reinforced the message, look beyond the surface. Judge people by their character, not their appearance. The bald head became iconic because it was so unusual. You could recognize Xavier instantly, the bald man in the wheelchair, and that visual struck people. It made them remember. It made them think. Xavier's philosophy, 12. But the wheelchair and baldness were just the visual elements. What really mattered was who Xavier was as a person, his philosophy, his approach to the mutant problem. See, I gave the X-Men two leaders, really, Xavier and Magneto, and they represented two different responses to prejudice, to oppression, to being hated for what you are. Magneto was the militant figure. He said, humanity hates us. They'll never accept us. We need to fight back. We need to dominate them before they destroy us. Homo superior should rule over Homo sapiens. And Xavier was the peaceful advocate. Xavier said, we need to prove we're not a threat. We need to protect the very people who hate us. We need to show them, through our actions, that we deserve to be treated as equals. We need to build bridges, not walls. Now, which approach was right? That was the question I wanted readers to grapple with. I didn't give easy answers. Both Xavier and Magneto had valid points. Both had experienced trauma, discrimination, hatred. Both wanted to protect their people, but their methods were different. And Xavier's method, the peaceful method, the educational method, the method of proving your worth through moral action, that required a different kind of strength. It required the strength to be attacked and not attack back, to be hated and still protect, to send your students into danger, to save people who would spit on them. That's not weakness. That's the hardest kind of strength there is. And Xavier could do that because his power wasn't physical. He didn't have the option of solving problems with violence. Well, he could have used his mental powers to control people, to force them to accept mutants, but he chose not to, because that would prove Magneto right. That would prove humans should fear mutants. Xavier as teacher, 1430. Let me talk about Xavier's role as a teacher, because this was central to the character. Xavier didn't just lead the X-Men, he taught them. The X-Men were students at his school for gifted youngsters. They were children, teenagers, young adults, all of them struggling with powers they didn't understand in a world that hated them for having those powers. And Xavier gave them sanctuary, safety, education, not just how to control their powers, but how to be good people, how to use their abilities responsibly, how to rise above the hatred directed at them. Think about what that means. Xavier took in kids who were rejected by their families, by society, by everyone. Kids who were told they were freaks, monsters, dangerous. And he told them, you're not monsters. You're gifted. You're special, and you have a choice. You can use your gifts to help people, or you can use them to hurt people. I'm going to teach you to be heroes. That's not just leadership. That's parenting. That's taking responsibility for shaping the next generation. And the wheelchair was crucial to this dynamic, because Xavier couldn't do the fighting for them. He couldn't swoop in and save them when missions went wrong. He had to prepare them, train them, trust them to handle situations on their own. He was the father figure who stayed home while his children went out into a dangerous world. And every time they left on a mission, he had to live with the fear that they might not come back, that his decisions, his training, might not be enough. That's a different kind of heroism, the heroism of the teacher, the mentor, the guide. Not the flashy heroism of the battlefield, but the quiet heroism of shaping young minds, of giving hope to the hopeless, of building something that will last beyond yourself. Physical weakness as strength 17. Now let me address something directly. Was I saying that disability is a weakness? No, absolutely not, and this is important. Xavier's physical condition wasn't a weakness. It was a different kind of strength. It forced him to develop abilities and qualities that able-bodied heroes often overlooked. Think about it. Most superheroes, when they face a problem, their first instinct is physical action. Punch the bad guy. Fly in and save the day. Use your super strength or your super speed or your energy blasts. Xavier couldn't do that, so he had to think, strategize, plan, understand his opponents psychologically, outthink them rather than outfight them. And more than that, his disability gave him empathy. Xavier knew what it was like to be limited, to be dependent on others, to have the world see you as less than. That understanding made him a better advocate for mutants, because mutants were people the world saw as less than human, as dangerous as other. Xavier understood that. He lived it, not because of his mutation, but because of his disability. The wheelchair wasn't a weakness to overcome. It was a source of wisdom, of perspective, of strength. And that was radical in 1963. That was a message that needed to be said. Physical disability doesn't make you less. It doesn't diminish your worth. It doesn't prevent you from being powerful, from being a leader, from being a hero. Xavier proved that. Every issue, every story, every time he sent his X-Men out to protect a world that hated them, every time he chose peace over violence, every time he taught rather than commanded, he proved that true strength is mental, moral, spiritual, not physical. Representation matters. 19. Let me talk about representation because it's become such an important conversation in recent years, and Xavier was one of the first examples of disability representation in superhero comics. In 1963, disabled characters in media were either tragic figures to be pitied, or they were villains whose disability explained their villainy, or they were problems to be solved, characters who would be cured by the end of the story and restored to normalcy. Xavier was none of those things. He wasn't tragic. He was powerful, respected, successful. He wasn't a villain. He was the moral compass of the series, and he wasn't going to be cured. His disability was permanent, part of who he was. Now, over the years, there have been stories where Xavier temporarily regained the ability to walk. And honestly, I think those stories miss the point, because the point wasn't that Xavier was heroic despite being disabled. The point was that his disability was irrelevant to his heroism. It didn't diminish him. It didn't limit his importance. The most powerful hero in the X-Men universe couldn't walk, and that was fine. That was who he was. That kind of representation mattered. It still matters, because when you never see people like yourself portrayed as heroes, as leaders, as powerful, you start to believe you can't be those things. You internalize society's prejudices. But when you see Professor X leading the X-Men, teaching and guiding and protecting, when you see him treated with respect by his students and allies, when you see him making world-changing decisions, you realize disability doesn't define you. It doesn't limit you. You can be extraordinary exactly as you are. Xavier versus Magneto dialectic, 21b. I want to talk more about the Xavier-Magneto relationship because it's really the heart of the X-Men's philosophical depth. Both men were powerful. Both were leaders. Both cared deeply about mutant kind's survival, but Xavier believed in coexistence. He believed that humans, despite their fear and hatred, could learn to accept mutants, that education and patience and proof of good intentions would eventually win over hearts and minds. Magneto believed in separation, or domination. He believed that humans would never accept mutants, that they would always seek to destroy what they feared, and that mutants needed to take control before humans destroyed them. And here's the thing. Both philosophies came from real, lived experience. Xavier had privilege. He was wealthy, educated, respected. He could afford to believe in peaceful solutions because the world had generally treated him well. Magneto had survived the Holocaust. He'd watched his family murdered. He'd experienced the worst of human hatred and genocide. He couldn't trust peaceful solutions because he'd seen what happens when a marginalized group trusts the majority to do the right thing. This dynamic, Xavier's hopeful idealism versus Magneto's traumatized pragmatism, this was me grappling with real civil rights debates, the tension between peaceful resistance and more militant approaches, the question of whether oppressed people should wait patiently for their oppressors to grant them rights, or whether they should take rights by force. I didn't have easy answers. I still don't. But I knew the question was important, and by embodying both perspectives and characters, by making both Xavier and Magneto sympathetic, by making both of them right in some ways and wrong in others, I could explore the question without preaching. And Xavier's wheelchair played into this. Because Xavier couldn't fight Magneto physically, their battles were always mental, philosophical, strategic. It was a battle of ideas, not fists, which is what the real civil rights struggle was about. Ideas, philosophies, visions of what society could become. Modern relevance, 2330. You know, it's been over 60 years since we created Professor X, and the character is more relevant now than ever. We're living in a time of intense tribalism. People are divided along racial, political, cultural lines. Social media amplifies our differences and our anger. It's easy to see people who disagree with us as enemies, as others, as less than human. And Xavier's message, his dream of coexistence, of education, of proving your humanity through your actions, that feels both necessary and difficult, because Xavier's way is hard. It's exhausting. It requires you to be patient with people who hate you, to protect people who would rather you didn't exist, to believe in progress even when you don't see any. But the alternative, fighting hatred with hatred, that doesn't work either. That just perpetuates the cycle. So Xavier's dream persists, the dream that different people, different races, different abilities, different cultures can live together, can respect each other, can see past their differences to their common humanity. Is it naive? Maybe, probably, but it's also necessary, because the alternative is endless conflict, endless division, endless hatred. Xavier, in his wheelchair, bald and physically vulnerable, represents the choice to hope anyway, to teach anyway, to build bridges anyway. That's not weakness. That's the hardest kind of strength there is. The Message, 2530. So why is Professor X bald and in a wheelchair? Because I wanted to create the most powerful hero in the Marvel Universe and prove that power has nothing to do with physical strength. Because I wanted to show that disability doesn't diminish you, doesn't limit your importance, doesn't prevent you from being a leader. Because I wanted to challenge assumptions about what heroes should look like, what they should be capable of, how they should lead, because I wanted to create a character who showed that the hardest battles are mental, moral, philosophical, not physical, because I wanted to say that true strength is having the wisdom to teach rather than command, the patience to build rather than destroy, the courage to hope when hope seems foolish. The baldness and the wheelchair weren't just character design. They were the message. They said, look beyond the surface, judge people by their character, not their appearance. Recognize that power comes in many forms. Understand that the greatest heroes are often those who look least like heroes. Professor Charles Xavier, bald, wheelchair-bound, physically vulnerable, became one of the most iconic characters in comics because he embodied a truth that needed to be told. The strongest mind in the weakest body is still the strongest. And that's what matters. Excelsior.